final area that I think makes as much difference as any in development is girls' education. And clearly boys' education is hugely powerful as well. You tend to get a little bit more bang for the buck with girls' education for a couple of reasons. One has to do with reproductive health and fertility. That one of the problems in the developing world is these huge population growth. And if you educate a boy, he will, on balance, have slightly fewer children, but the effect is much greater when you educate a girl. And the other has to do with what people do with incomes. When you educate somebody, of course, they tend to have greater capacity to generate income. The embarrassing truth about this is that men are incredibly bad spenders of extra income. And one of it's the topic that I wrote about yesterday in my column, and it's something that we explore in the book. For people earning less than about $1 per person per day, the evidence suggests that about 2% of incomes go towards education, which is a great investment. In contrast, about 20% goes to a combination of alcohol, tobacco, prostitution, sugary drinks, Coke, and so on, and very extravagant festivals. If you could take 4 percentage points out of the alcohol, tobacco, prostitution pool and put it in the education pool, it would have a transformative effect. And one way of doing that is to give women more control over the purse strings, more control over legal assets such as property, and more control over savings. And there have been some interesting experiments to show how those do work. And certainly education does tend to give girls more capacity to earn income, and that money is much more likely to be spent on their kids. It's also something that I think we're getting better at figuring out how to do. It's not just a question of building schools. It's also a question of things we tend not to think about. Probably the most cost-effective way of all of getting more kids in school is deworming kids. We never think about this because most American kids don't have worms. Most school kids in poor countries do have worms. The result is they're more likely to be anemic, and that's particularly true of high school girls who are menstruating and are already prone to anemia. And then on top of that, when they have worms, that adds to the anemia, which makes them harder to concentrate, more likely to be sick, more likely to miss school, and more likely to be malnourished. You can deworm a child with 1 pill of albendazole once a year. It costs a few cents, even with distribution costs, maybe 50 cents, and it reduces absenteeism on average by about 30 days over an academic year. It's an incredibly powerful intervention. I think we're getting smarter about what kind of interventions work, how one can have an impact, and when you go out and see what happens when these girls get education, it's just transformative. One of my favorite stories is of a girl, Beatrice Bira, who grew up in Uganda. She was not sent to school. Her parents thought they couldn't afford it, and they wanted her to help out at home, help out with chores, look after her siblings. And then her parents got a goat through Heifer International. Do you know Heifer? The Heifer Project. So they had the goat, they sold the milk, made them feel a little better off, and with that milk money, they decided to send Beatrice to school. She's 3 years behind, but works really hard, and really is an incredibly bright kid. And so she rockets to the top of her class. All during elementary school, she's at the top of her class. Beginning in middle school and high school, she does very, very well in the nationwide standard exams. Becomes the first person in her village to go abroad to study, and a couple years ago graduated from Connecticut College. And now she's doing a master's and wants to go back and work on these kinds of development issues in Uganda. People sometimes, I think, feel psyched out by these issues because they just seem so vast. You know, we're not going to solve the problems of girls' illiteracy or of trafficking. And these issues seem so vast that we sometimes just kind of, I think, turn aside from them. And one of the things that I've really learned, I think, in writing about them is that that's kind of the wrong measure. The test of whether you make a difference isn't whether you solve a problem. It's whether, for some people, incrementally, you can really have a transformative impact. I mean, like the people who supplied that goat to Beatrice, for example. I think the story that speaks to me on that is one that is utterly hokey. But let me leave you with it anyway. It's a Hawaiian parable. And I traveled with a Hawaiian cameraman a lot in Africa, and he used to tell it. And it's about a boy walking along the beach. I'm sure some of you have heard this. All the starfish have washed up. Do you know the story? And so he's frantically throwing the starfish back into the sea, and a man comes along and says, "What are you doing? There are millions of starfish. You can't possibly make a difference." The boy reaches down, throws another one in, and says, "Well, sure made a difference to that one." That's exactly right. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to take questions.